her privacy, that also breached Article 9 of the Convention regarding accessibility. So again, we see that the umbrella of accessibility under the Convention is quite large one, and it could give effect to other rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, although in these cases, they related to civil and political rights. But again, this might be something where in the future, this would be extended to economic, social, and cultural rights as well. Now, in New Zealand, what we've seen so far is a lack of, obviously, the lack of domestic protection, but also a lack of willingness from the courts to sort of recognize such a hybrid model. So far, they've been very strict in terms of distinguishing between what's been incorporated and what's not in the Act, or sort of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act or the Human Rights Act or any other domestic legislation that incorporates economic, social, and cultural rights. But I it's sort of hazarding a guess, and I guess this is the part of the paper I would need to sort of do more research on and write, is whether the coming into effect of the Accessibility for New Zealanders bill in its current form or potentially in a changed format would make any difference to the approach of the courts in using that implied model of rights that, again, I think Malcolm was talking about, in sort of implying a lot of economic, social, and cultural rights into the state's obligations under non-discrimination and accessibility, and again, giving effect to them indirectly. And also what I want to investigate is other avenues, for instance, under the jurisdiction of the New Zealand Human Rights Commission and the Human Rights Review Tribunal, and what the Office of the Ombudsman has done so far in terms of protecting equality in access to official information. And the CRPD committee has not considered any complaints from New Zealand yet. It has the jurisdiction, it has had that since 2016, but there hasn't been any cases before the committee from New Zealand yet, but maybe in the future that could be another, again, especially if the accessibility bill is passed, that could be another option for operationalizing economic, social, and cultural rights in New Zealand without necessarily incorporating them into legislation. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lida, that was great. And I think there are clear links between what you're proposing in terms of creative solutions in New Zealand, leading up to engaging with the treaty bodies, and particularly the CRPD. So that leads in well to Jessie and Julia's paper. So Jessie will start.
I'm next, okay, great. I'll turn on my video for those online. So thank you very much to the chairs and to everyone for coming. I'm going to speak quite, can everybody hear me? Yes, okay, I'm getting a request to unmute myself, but I think that's unnecessary. So I'm going to speak quite, I'm going to tell a story, I guess, about my own involvement in parallel reporting to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which I've had the opportunity to do twice. And I'd like to first acknowledge that there are a lot of people in this room and online who have probably a lot more experience doing this, including Claire Mann and Beth Goldblatt, as well as Paul Hunt, who probably will notice instantly my amateur errors in this, but I think will be helpful actually for other people in the room to know how, know where I've gone wrong or where difficulties have arisen, because thinking strategically about using those processes in the future, that might be helpful, right? So I have had the opportunity to be involved in a parallel reporting process under the ESCR with respect to the right to housing twice now. The first time was in 2015, and it was as part of a larger report brought by what we would call in the UK a charity, but we could call them an NGO, called Just Fair, which is the first charity in England, the first charity in England to specifically target social rights. And I'm going to put a link in the chat for those of you who, let's see if this will work. For those of you who are interested, you can see the report that they produced. So the report was, if you look at the report, you can see it's a 250-page report, and it tracked the main social rights in the ISSCR. So I wrote a chapter on the right to housing for them. Someone wrote a chapter on the right to food. There was one on the rights of people with disabilities, and if there were and a chapter on the right to health. And so the primary motivation for Just Fair was to use this in domestic advocacy and then take it to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So the report that I wrote for them was much longer than something that you could submit to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. At that point, you could submit something to them that was about 3,000 words as your whole report. But they wanted to use this in their domestic advocacy. They wanted to really make a difference in the at home in the political landscape. So they approached me, and I know that one of the reasons they selected me was because they were looking for people who would not appear too radical and would be hard to discredit, or who wouldn't make social rights seem too political. Because this is a problem in the UK, that social rights are seen as this really political, non-legal, non-justiciable issue. So they selected me to write the chapter on the right to housing for them, but they were also very concerned to have a lot of buy-in from other major charities who worked in the housing sphere. So there were a lot of negotiations about what could go into the report so that they would get endorsements from the major NGOs around the UK. They wanted to come on board to put pressure on the government domestically. So really they were using the UN process as part of a much longer term strategy, but really hoping to get domestic traction. So in the end, the report I think remains a really significant resource actually, and I think it's really useful. It got a lot of domestic traction, particularly around the right to food, some around the right to housing as well, but particularly around the right to food. So that brought a lot of attention to Just Fair's work. Just Fair did the work to take that 250-page report and turn it into 3,000 words and take that to the committee as a parallel report on the UN's on the UK's performance under the ISSCR. It took that to the UN, and it was really pleased because it was able to get some of the language in the report reflected in the UN committee's report on the UK's performance. So reflecting some of the concerns in the report, and including around the right to housing, which was great. Great. I was really happy to see that. And they got that language into the criticism of the UK by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but they were prevented basically in then bringing that back home as the next plank in their domestic advocacy by the fact that the report was released in the same week as a significant Brexit development and got no airtime whatsoever, right? So, the best laid plans. But I think the report remains really significant, and I think it gave a lot of, it was a foundation for future work for other charities. So for example, then a number of charities got together and put together a joint report under the Universal Periodic Review, specifically targeting social rights as well. So it was sort of a model that was then used again. But it was with this experience in mind that when I came back to Australia a few years later, in 2019, I thought, well, we should really use these around Australia. And I was aware that Australia's reporting cycle was coming up for the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And a few of us talked around, perhaps actually in this conference a few years ago, about maybe we could do something, maybe we could get together a consortium of NGOs who would take this forward. So in the end, it was the middle of COVID and nobody was thinking about this. But I did end up working with the Mercy Foundation, who's a charity or an NGO, we would say here in Australia, that takes a structural approach to ending homelessness. And they were open to making a parallel report under the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So now what had happened in the meantime, and what I did not realize, and what many people I think didn't realize, judging from my frantic calls on Twitter for anyone with any expertise in this area to get back in touch with me, with zero responses out there in the Twitter sphere, making me think nobody in Australia on Twitter was working in this anyway, was that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the reporting process under that had since transitioned to what's called the simplified reporting procedure. And just for anyone who doesn't know what that is, so it used to be that the state would produce a report, and then you had the opportunity as civil society, NGOs, academics to say, look, you can see this report, but it's not really telling you the whole picture. And I'm going to riff off that report and write my own parallel report here, which is going to show you stuff that the state's not telling you in the report. You no longer have the opportunity to do that. Now the committee produces what's called a list of issues prior to reporting. And the input from NGOs, civil society, academics has to come before that. You have to get your issue onto that list. And to do that, you have to do something that looks quite different. And I'm going to put another link in here, if I can find it. You now have to just create a list of questions to send to the committee that they should ask the government to respond to. So here is that list. So then it's much shorter. There were no examples of lists of issues prior to reporting by NGOs to any state under the ESCR that I could find, because Australia is like the first suite of states going through under the simplified reporting procedure. So I found some examples from other conventions that have transitioned to the simplified reporting procedure. The thing about the simplified reporting procedure, it's also changed all the timelines. So you used to have like a year after the state submitted its report to go off and read the report and think about it. And then you could come back with your report. Now you've got 3 months or 6 months before the committee examines Australia orally in the first stage to produce your list of questions. We were actually late in doing this, but what I've learned from this was that the committee wants people to engage. They need parallel reports because they are not in a position to evaluate the state's report. They're in Geneva, or they come together in Geneva. They're only looking at it on the paperwork. They are not really able to evaluate it. They don't have the person power, and they just don't have the expertise, right? They need parallel reports. So they really wanted, they did everything, bent over backwards to allow us to submit our report late. It doesn't appear on the UN website. If you go in and you'll see the shadow reports for Australia, the shadow lists of issues, you can't find them on the UN website, but they made it available to the committee, and the committee did have us appear before them by Zoom, and they did examine us, and some of the issues that we took up in the list of issues have appeared on the list of issues prior to reporting that Australia will have to respond to. So it was, it felt very hectic. It felt very much like there wasn't much to follow, and there wasn't, neither the Mercy Foundation nor I were particularly well-versed in how to do this. But I think my takeaways from it would be, from the process overall, is that if you're going to engage in parallel reporting, I think you need to have both the domestic and the international as angles in mind. So you have to be, or it works best in my view, if you're using your UN work to gain attention and traction at home, and that you're using both at the same time to sort of build a picture of naming and shaming on one level, but awareness at home. And that sometimes will work, sometimes it won't work, and you can't control the circumstances in which your report or the UN's report will come out. Other things are happening in the world, right, that might completely bury them. The other thing I've learned, though, from this is that it will only really make a difference if 10, 15 different parallel reports go before the UN, and that all of those organizations or academics or NGOs or whoever they are, individuals even, are using those domestically and then using the international system as well. When we submitted our report, we were one of two organizations, the Mercy Foundation, one of two organizations. So it was the Mercy Foundation and an organization whose names I have forgotten, but who work on drug policy. And their intervention was really useful and really welcome, but we were both such narrow such narrow focus. So knowing that we were one of only 2 organisations that was going to be presenting, the Mercy Foundation and I tried to craft this list of issues as broadly as we could. And you could do that with economic, social and cultural rights because they're all interrelated. We use them to discuss discrimination, poverty, health outcomes. So we tried to use the right to housing, which is the focus, to wedge all these other policy problems that Australia has into that report. And we did that by really heavy footnoting and referencing in the report for anyone who wants to, or in the list of issues prior to reporting that we provided. I will leave that there. I'm really happy to take questions on it in the discussion, but I think I've come to the end of my time.
We've got a couple of minutes if you need.
I think I'll leave it there, and then because I think it'd be great for people to ask questions. But I think it's strategic. You've got to use it strategically. It's really, really useful to use it. But I would encourage that we really get people using it more broadly, because if one NGO does it, it's going to make really no difference. But if you have a great consortium of people, or you've got 10 different domestic NGOs, then you might get traction at home, and you'll get that reflected in the list of issues as well. So Australia now has till September 2023 to produce its report, which should track the list of issues and respond to the issues that the committee has asked it. So we've got a while before we'll see what the committee will do, but I'm continuing to work with the Mercy Foundation to sort of equip other charities and NGOs and individuals to use this process in the future. Thank you.